Tell us about it in the meeting, which is about to start. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our latest session in our series, Why Marx and Party Building. Tonight, Ian Spencer is looking at Marx, Engels, and their engagement with Marxists in Russia. And you can see his subtitle this session, Was There a Russian Road to Socialism? And no doubt we'll also be talking about their influence on the young Bolsheviks, etc. Thank you for joining us, Ian.
Good evening, comrades. The Russian Marxists, in a sense, are a continuation of what we've already discussed when we look, for example, at the French Workers' Party program, and also, of course, the passionate debates between Marx and the anarchists, which has a particular form when we look at Marx and Engels and the Russian Marxists. Marx himself didn't have that much correspondence with Plekhanov, for example, although Engels did. But Marx, to my surprise, I wasn't aware until I started doing the research for this, that the extent of Marx's discussions with the Narodniks, who kind of predated Russian Social Democratic Party formations. So, in a sense, we're looking again at this relationship between Marxism and anarchism, but not so much focusing on the likes of Bakunin, and also the importance of the relationship between the proletariat and the peasantry in the context of the development of Russia. The development of Russia was of great interest to Marx. Not only, as we'll go on to see, was he familiar with Alexander Hson and a number of others who visited him in London, but he also took the trouble to learn Russian. I came across one of Marx's letters written in 1870, where he talks about deciding to learn Russian. And by 1871, he regarded himself as pretty fluent, at least in reading it. So he took a great deal of interest in Russia, and in particular, the formation of Russian land holdings, because, of course, Russia was geographically, the Russian Empire was 1/5 of the land surface of the world, and there was a particular form of Russian landholding involving the peasant obshchina, the kind of common land holdings of Russian peasants. As an aside, I'm also going to mention a number of other things relating to art and literature, because quite apart from the political impact of the Narodniki, anyone who's spent any time studying Russian literature of the 19th century sees frequent references to debates that were taking place within the Narodnik tradition. For example, Fyodor Dostoevsky's book, The Devils, is a direct reference to the Nechayev case, which we'll come on to in a moment. I mentioned it before in talking about Bakunin. And so apart from that, there is this whole question of the social makeup of the Russian Empire, which gave a particular form to political organizations, both of the Narodnik type and also then subsequently of the Social Democratic type. So without further ado then, have a little look at, this is Alexander Hson. Those are his dates, 1812 to 1870. And of course, a lot of this takes place against the background of the fact that Russia was still predominantly feudal. Up until 1861, there was still serfdom. There were different forms of unfree labor throughout Russia's history, but the fact that serfdom remained in force until 1861 is, of course, highly significant. The particular form taken by serfdom often relied upon an extraction of the surplus from the serf population on the basis of corvée, so compulsory labour on the lord's land, as it were, and an expropriation of the product of that. And one of the important things about this, I think, is if you look at whether you're looking at Russian literature or whether you're looking at the political forms taken by the Narodniks and then subsequently by the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, the relationship that many of the people who were writing on behalf of the Narodniks, for example, was that they were frequently related to the Russian gentry. They were deeply rooted in Russian peasant life. And it's not surprising, even at the outbreak of revolutionary activity in Russia, something like around 3% of the Russian population were industrial proletarians. So we're looking at social formations which address themselves to a vast peasantry. And not only a vast peasantry, but a vast peasantry which had been increasingly going through this process of immiseration. The emancipation of serfs in 1861 didn't necessarily mean something that was greeted with great joy by the serfs themselves. In order to actually obtain their freedom, they were expected to actually compensate their former masters for their freedom. And it was just another way in which there was a shift of wealth from the poor to the very rich. The Narodniki, in the style of, I should just add here that the word narod corresponds really to the German Volk. So if you think of the idea of the Narodniki as being the narod is the Russian people, the ethnic Russian people. And of course, that becomes quite important in all sorts of ways. The extent to which, for example, that means some kind of adherence to the Orthodox Church, the extent to which that was exclusive of the Jewish population of the Russian Empire. And but in this context as well, it was also related to the relationship with people and the land. So you can think of all sorts of ways in which this social relationship affected, for example, the expression in Russian literature. Lev Tolstoy, for example, Leo Tolstoy, was a landowner who had, his concubines among Russian peasant girls and that kind of thing, but also had this notion around this idea of going to the people and finding inspiration in the nobility of the peasantry, as it were. But the Narodniki generally were organized in kind of secret societies. I mentioned here just one, that of Nikolai Cheski, not to be confused with the composer and musician, no relation whatsoever. And the Tchaikovsky Circle, for example, was a influential Narodnik group. I'll say a little bit more about the Russian Obshchina. The Russian peasantry, the way in which it was organized, the Russian agricultural organization, was often around common land held in common by groups of peasants. So on an estate, there would be common land, which would be used by all places to graze animals or whatever. But there would also be strips of land, parcels of land, which would be divided up between the peasants. And these would be subject to periodic redistributions. The idea was to make sure it didn't, for example, mean that one person got all the fertile land and another person got scrub land and wasted land. So even if you got a pretty poor deal on one redistribution, you might expect for a reasonably good one on the next one. And the idea was that this was a kind of a democratic expression. Now, I wouldn't want to emphasize that too much. It was still thoroughly patriarchal. It was still basically women would have been excluded from this, but notions around common land was a feature of the Narodnik tradition, in which there was an argument being put forward that there was a specifically Russian road to a socialist society, which would take account of the fact that the land was, to all intents and purposes, already held in common by the peasants. And this later became the subject of important debates with the Narodniki, but also Narodnaya Volya, which followed on afterwards, People's Will, and including direct interventions by Marx himself on the question. So the Obshchina was the Russian peasant commune. Sometimes it's also known as the Mir. The Mir means a number of things, but it means peace and also the land, as it were. And in this context, also was somewhat synonymous with the Obshchina. So Land and Liberty, or Land and Freedom, Zemlya i Volya, was a group that was established between 1860 and 1879. And it was a one in which many of the people who were subsequently leading figures within Russian Marxism, in particular Plekhanov, played a part. There was a split in Land and Liberty, Land and Freedom, and it was known as the Black Repartition. Just to explain what that means, Chorny Perdiel, Chorny Perdiel. So a redistribution of the black soil, as it were, the fertile land. So it called itself, it named itself after that. So Alexander Herzen, for example, who was hugely influential on in the Narodnik tradition, was a member of the International Working Men's Association, and he published the Communist Manifesto in Russian, translated originally by Mikhail Bakunin in his journal The Bell, Kolokol. So Herzen played an important part in the dissemination of Marxist ideas in Russia, even though his influence, as it were, was of the Narodnik one. He also published a novel called Who is to Blame? Kto vinovat? And that will crop up later as we go on. I also want to mention Pyotr Lavrov. Those are his dates, 1823 to 1900, who represented, in a sense, the kind of more moderate wing of the Narodniki. Lavrov also corresponded with Marx, and this is one of the things that was intriguing. Later on, when we come to look at Vera Zasulich, when Vera Zasulich wrote to Marx, she was talking about people who have been hugely influenced by Marx's work, particularly volume 1 of Capital. But Marx was quite clearly unimpressed with the idea that these people represented, in any sense, Marxists. So here's Nikolai Cheski. He was well respected by Marx. Marx, as I say, taught himself to read Russian between 1870 and 1871. He was hugely influential on the Narodnik tradition. Chernyshevsky had studied Hegel and Feuerbach. He'd become a socialist through reading the work of the French utopian socialist Charles Fourier, and of course he'd read Alexander Herzen. For his radical ideas, he was imprisoned in the Peter and Paul fortress, which is just outside St. Petersburg. And in there, he wrote What is to be Done. And there's no accident that Lenin called Что делать, what is to be done, what he did, because it was a conscious reference to the writings of Nikolai Chernyshevsky. After he was released from the Peter and Paul fortress, Chernyshevsky was exiled to Siberia, and although he played an important part in the development of Russian literature, his political influence was largely in the Narodnik tradition. After the kind of dissolution, as it were, of Narodniki, they really developed into a rather more centralized organization called People's Will, Narodnaya Volya. The importance really of this group is that, in a sense, they were the precursor of the Socialist Revolutionary Party. There were some intriguing characters in it. They came under quite a lot of influence from Mikhail Bakunin, although Bakunin himself wasn't an active participant in their group. But, for example, Mark Netanson became subsequently leader of the Socialist Revolutionaries and played an interesting role on the left of that party, and eventually took his group, which had split from the Socialist Revolutionaries, into the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Alexander Mikhailov by contrast, subsequently died in prison for his political activity. And I have to mention Nikolai Morozov, if only because he, when I research these people, I never cease to be amazed at how fascinating they are as individuals. Morozov met Marx in London in 1880, and it's through Morozov that the question was raised with Marx as to, would it be possible for Russia, as it were, to skip a phase? Would it be possible? Because the tendency was, among those who had read Capital, was to kind of think of there being a necessity to go through the period of capitalism before you could get to a socialist society. But what Morozov did was raise the question about whether the Russian Obshchina could form the basis of the common ownership of land. And from that point of view, did Russia have to go through all the misery of developing capitalism before it could finally go on to become a socialist society? And of course, we'll come back to that question, very important question, when we come to look at Verzulich. Morozov was intriguing in many ways. One of them was that pretty much after the Russian Revolution, he kind of dropped out of politics, only to re-emerge in 1942, at the age of 88, enrolling in the Red Army as a sniper, and took part in the defense of Leningrad. An intriguing character, and he died in his 90s in 1946. Sergei Nechayev I've mentioned before, and this notion around the physical force tradition, the idea that you could bring about revolution by the individual act. So the most famous one, and it's pictured here, is the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881. And the thing that they're best known for, really, but of course, the accession to the throne then of Tsar Alexander III was a kind of period of reaction, a period when reforms that were introduced by his son, by his father, were regarded as being counterproductive. Alexander II was aware of the possibility of revolution. He was aware of the restive nature of the peasantry, and the concession of the abolition of serfdom was seen as having failed in the terms of the autocracy. And of course, the other character that's probably worth mentioning here is Alexander Ilyich Ulyanov, Lenin's older brother, who, on the anniversary of the assassination of Alexander II, was caught carrying bombs walking along the Nevsky Prospect. There's the Kazansky Sabor, the Kazan Cathedral, which is where the commemoration service was supposed to take place for Alexander II, and Alexander III was turning up to that, and Alexander Ulyanov had planned to throw a bomb at the Tsar. He was captured and hanged. Some of the group who also took part in it were subsequently pardoned, but Alexander wasn't one of them. So Narodnaya Volya were hugely influential, and actually had more correspondence with Marx than most of the subsequent Social Democrats did. What's also interesting is, of course, Russian social democracy really split from Narodnaya Volya, and in 1883, Georgy Panov, Verzulich, Pavlov Axelrod, and Leo Deutsch, about whom I'll say almost nothing, formed the Emancipation of Labour Group. And really, this is the first attempt at a Marxist party in the context of the Russian Empire. I've presented it here as if it was really the Emancipation of Labour Group, and this name just trips off the tongue. The Union of Struggle for the Emancipation of the Working Class. Trust me, it's no better in Russian. Союз борьбы за освобождение рабочего класса. Well, that just trips off the tongue as a party name, which was founded in part by Lenin, and of course Julius Martov, who subsequently became a Menshevik. Of course, in there too was representatives of the Jewish Workers' Bund and many other little groups. But really, it's this split between the Narodnik tradition and Narodnaya Volya was a bit more centralized than the original Narodniki, and here we have the development of a recognizable party of the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party. Oh, sorry. Mouse fingers. So this is Georgy Plekhanov, and Plekhanov, in a sense, is usually credited. He wasn't the very first person ever to be regarded as a Marxist, but he was the most significant in terms of leaving a body of written work and of playing a huge role in the development of Marxist ideas in the context of Russia. So, as I say, he was a member of the Zemlya i Volya, Land and Freedom, and the Black Repartition. He was arrested in 1877, 1878, and then emigrated to Geneva. You may wonder why everybody seems to end up in Geneva. It sounds quite posh, doesn't it? Well, I'm just going to emigrate to Geneva then. Marx gave me a little clue as to why Geneva was a popular destination. In reading some of the correspondence, Marx at one point, in writing to Kugelmann, says that he wished he could just go and live in Geneva, because whereas it costs him £500 a year to live in London, he could easily get by on £200 or £300 a year in Geneva. Of course, the other aspect of it was that Geneva had a long and noble history of being fairly liberal and not persecuting people with dissident ideas. So Georgy Plekhanov, along with the others, helped found the Emancipation of Labour group and corresponded with Engels. 1883 was when really Plekhanov became a Marxist, and by that point, Marx was already dead. But Plekhanov did a lot to, for example, translate Marx and Engels into Russian. They issued a better version of the Communist Manifesto after Bakunin's miserable effort. And Plekhanov is an intriguing character in so many ways. He's my one volume of one of two volumes that I possess of Plekhanov's work. Has the program of the Social Democratic Group, the Emancipation of Labour Social Democratic Group, and some of you may remember my discussion of the program of the French Workers' Party, and if you can see clear similarities between the program of the French Socialist Workers' Party and the Emancipation of Labour Group. But what's interesting is that this program is importantly different to the subsequent draft program of the Russian Social Democrats, which Plekhanov also had a hand in writing. Like the French program, it starts off, it has a kind of a maximal part and a minimal part, as it were. So, for example, it starts off, as did the French program, saying the economic emancipation of the working class will be achieved only by the transfer to the collective ownership of the working people of all means and products of production, and the organization of all functions and social and economic life in accordance with the requirements of society. So it's bang in there, maximal stuff. Everything gets transferred to the proletariat. The program goes on and makes a nod in the direction of the Emancipation of Labour Group, also acknowledges the great principles of the former International Working Men's Association and identity of interests among the working people of the whole civilized world. Later on, but this still bears the kind of marks, as it were, of the Narodnik tradition. So, for example, later on, he talks about the fact that the Narodnik tradition it doesn't really distance itself from Narodnaya Volya, except insofar as they don't necessarily, well, I'll read it out. Pursuing the aims by all means in its power, the emancipation of labour group at the same time recognises the necessity for terrorist struggle against the absolute government, and differs from the Narodnaya Volya party only on the question of the so-called seizure of power by the Revolutionary Party and of the tasks and immediate activity of socialists among the working class. So although firmly rooted in the idea of the emancipation of the working class, the proletariat, there is still clearly a reference back to the important, and this is in part because of the popularity of Narodnaya Volya. This is in part because of the sheer size of the Russian peasantry, and also a recognition of the fact that this is going to be an illegal organization and may well need to fight. By the time we get to the second draft program of the Russian Social Democrats, however, this is that bit has been dropped, and what we see instead. Plekhanov wrote it in 1884, and it was published in 1888 in, well, guess where, Geneva. So the important thing about it is, and especially as we realize that later on, of course, Plekhanov became a Menshevik and was very critical of the Bolsheviks, it was the emphasis upon democracy. The direct participation of each citizen in the management of social affairs presupposes the abolition of the present system of political representation and its replacement by direct popular legislation. And here we have a kind of a notion not related to the Obshchina at all, but the notion that all society will be governed, as it were, by the direct participative democracy of the producers themselves. It does make some reference to the Obshchina, for example, whereas the ideal of the village community members lies in the past, under conditions of patriarchal economy, the political complement of which was Tsarist autocracy, the lot of the industrial worker can be improved only thanks to the development of more modern and free forms of communal life. So we're not in the direction of the Obshchina, and this has been, this will be, the importance of this will be when we look at Marx's understanding of the importance of the peasant commune in society. So after in the 1903 Congress, in which the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party split, initially Plekhanov supported Lenin, but by 1905, and in particular because of the 1905 revolution, effectively supported the Mensheviks. By which time, of course, the names Bolshevik and Menshevik were unrelated to whether they were, throughout that period. Whether they were the majority or the minority, only really related to the brief period in which the Bolsheviks were the majority of the editorial board of Iskra, and I'll come on to Iskra in a moment. But throughout much of the history of the Russian Social Democratic and Labour Party, the Mensheviks were in the majority, and you'll see this in terms of the number of people who we mentioned who subsequently end up being Mensheviks rather than Bolsheviks. Plekhanov, in common with many other Mensheviks, supported Russia's role in World War I. One of the other people who, of course, supported the emancipation of Labour Group was Pavel Borisovich Axelrod, who came from a sort of poor Jewish family, and at the age of 16 became a socialist by reading the works of Ferdinand Lassalle. Remember me mentioning Pyotr Lavrov, in the Narodnik, the kind of moderate wing of the Narodniki. Pavlov Axelrod started up a study group based on Pyotr Lavrov's ideas when he was a student at Kiev University. Something I didn't really talk very much about was the going to the people movement, which reached its culmination in 1874. This was particularly popular among students. The idea was, among the Narodniki, was the idea that you go out amongst the people and spread the revolutionary gospel, as it were, spread the revolutionary word. And the idea of, there was a tendency to idealize the inherent socialism of the Russian peasantry. And so students would go off and work among peasants, either giving legal advice or as doctors, or sometimes just simply working as field hands to work alongside Russian peasants and tell them about socialism. And that was this idea of this going to the people movement that was reached a kind of culmination in 1874, and Pavlov Axelrod was part of that. He himself at the time had been under the influence of Bakunin and had joined the Land and Liberty group and was part, along with Plekhanov of the Black Repartition. And guess where he ended up? Geneva, which seems to be the place where they all became Marxists. So he emigrated to Geneva in 1880 and became a milkman. I didn't realize that until recently. Axelrod was a milkman. He developed. He produced buttermilk and kefir and sold it door to door, and that was how he supported his family with 3 children. So they didn't all just sit about, in Geneva as a milkman. So he joined the Emancipation of Labour group in 1883, but by 1903 he'd supported the Mensheviks. At the time, he was a kind of de facto leader of the Mensheviks, but that, of course, was then subsequently ceded to Martov. Notwithstanding that, he was part of the Russian delegation to the Zimmerwald Conference of internationalist socialists who had stayed truthful, as it were, to the original idea of the Second International, which was to stop the war, to prevent the war from happening in the first place. By 1917, he joined Kerensky's provisional government. And here's another fun fact. Did you know that Kerensky's dad taught Lenin? They came from the same village as Simbirsk. Kerensky's dad subsequently went on to become a kind of senior school inspector or whatever. But there's an interesting fun fact of Russian revolutionary life. Kerensky's dad taught Lenin. Moving on to Vera Zasulich. Vera Zasulich is interesting for many reasons. But one is her important correspondence with Karl Marx. Even before she was a Marxist, she was aware of the importance of Marx because of her association with the Narodniki. So she originally came from a kind of anarchist background, as it were, and the fact that she had letters that were found in the presence of Nechayev, who I mentioned before, who was responsible for killing someone before going off and tracking down Bakunin in Switzerland, and just helping to discredit Bakunin enormously. And Nechayev himself, as I say, was one of the characters that inspired Dostoevsky's book, The Devils, or the Possessed. In Russian, it's Besy. So because of that relationship with Nechayev, Zasulich was imprisoned in 1868. Then she shot and wounded one Colonel Fyodor Trepov. Trepov had a man flogged for refusing to take off his cap, and the man who was flogged was a comrade of Vera Zasulich. So she shot him, not unreasonably. And but what was even more amusing was that she was then subsequently acquitted by the jury. She had a very savvy lawyer who managed to show that Trepov was in fact had behaved like an absolute brute. And turned it into a trial about not just Trepov, but the nature of the autocracy itself. So she was acquitted by the jury, which just neatly reminds us of the importance of jury trial, which is currently under attack from the current government. And guess where she ended up? Yes, good old Geneva, fled to Switzerland to become a Marxist and was one of the founding members of the editorial board of Iskra. Her correspondence with Marx is interesting and important. If you recall, I'd mentioned about Morozov back in as one of the characters, Nikolai Morozov, who'd been spent time talking to Marx about the Russian land question. And so Verzulich wrote to Marx to ask about whether, as it were, Russia could kind of skip a phase in terms of the Russian obshchina as becoming the basis for the common ownership of land. Marx, when he finally replied, the actual letter itself is only a couple of paragraphs, and it's not really particularly illuminating. What's much more interesting, if anybody has a fancy for it, is in volume 24 of the collected works of Marx and Engels. Marx went into 4 drafts before he finally decided to send really quite a short letter. And the first and second drafts are by far and away the most interesting. So Marx, in looking at this question, basically seemed to be saying, yes, in principle, the obshchina could be the basis of a common ownership of landed property. However, there were a lot of caveats to it, and put simply, it went something like this. Firstly, Russian agriculture in the context of the obshchina wasn't particularly efficient, and it was already the case by this time that Russia was having to import food to feed its urban proletariat. It wasn't able to obtain enough food from this backward form of agricultural production. So on the one hand, Marx is saying the social relations that are are part of the obshchina could be the basis for common ownership of land. However, it's grossly inefficient. And in fact, what really needs to happen is there to be a scientific, mechanized form of agriculture. Now, it could be that the obshchina could transform itself from being parcels of land, as it were, to farming the great open steppe and all the other things to feed the proletariat and themselves. But Marx was very aware of the need for increased agricultural production to be a precondition, as it were, for the possibility of socialism. More importantly, basically, Marx is saying, yes, it could form the basis of a jump straight to a socialized form of the ownership of land, but first there has to be a Russian Revolution. Now, there was a reason why Marx learned Russian, not because of his admiration for Chernyshevsky. He and Engels were aware of the role of the Tsar of Russia as the gendarme of Europe, the idea that a German revolution could not be successful without a Russian revolution because of the fear that the Tsar would move to crush any socialist revolution that would broke out in Germany or indeed anywhere else. And of course, this was also in the context of the Polish rebellions, for example, in 1848, indeed in 1830 as well, and the importance of that Marx attached to Polish nationalism as having a positive, radical, and progressive component in breaking away from Tsarist Russia. Tsarist Russia was seen as one of the greatest possible impediments to the possibility of a world revolution, and in particular breaking out in Europe. So she corresponded with Marx, and Marx was equivocal in terms of the reply. Yes, in principle, it could be done, but first there has to be a Russian Revolution. Secondly, let's make no bones about it. The idea of communal production on this small scale, it would have to change, as Marx points out in the first draft. What use is it to have 10 desiatines of land when you only have the farming implements that can cultivate 2 desiatines of land? Marx regarded it as crucially important that there would be an improvement in productivity. Verzulich herself became a Menshevik in 1903, and later on joined with Plekhanov in his small group, which tried to kind of maintain a united position by 1914. Well, comrades, I just want to leave you then with one other little kind of fun fact of the relationship between Russian narodniks and art and literature. Oscar Wilde, one of his first plays was called Vera, or the Nihilists. And Oscar Wilde, who was anarchistically inclined and was influenced by Peter Kropotkin, was inspired by the case of Verzulich's shooting of Colonel Fyodor Trepov, and wrote Vera, or the Nihilists. So, without further ado, thank you, comrades, for listening, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Ian. Brilliant presentation, as we've become used to by you. Thank you. Lots of fun facts, including the fact that you speak Russian clearly. Very good. Comrades, if you have a question or would like to make a contribution, please can you click raise hand. I'm going to make a little start and ask you a few questions, if that's okay. I think you answered that question very well. You know, can you go from a backwards peasant-based, you know, where the vast majority is peasantry still at that time, backward, small scale, etc. Can you go directly to socialism? And you know, the answer is basically no. You cannot, because it's so inefficient and you cannot produce enough to feed everybody, especially when you already have to import a lot of food. Perhaps, yes, if there'd been a world revolution elsewhere, etc., and you'd have given them the space, or they would have had the space to develop themselves, but that doesn't seem likely. Now, to the question then of the people's world and Narodnaya Volya. It's an interesting. They were very popular. They were quite well spread, and they do remind me of some kind of groups today where you basically you kind of pretend, you know, the way to speak to the workers or then the peasantry is you have to become one of them. Is you have to go to the peasantry. So you had these intellectuals, students, rich kids go into the country, going to the people, and pretend to be peasants basically in order to speak to the peasants, which, as I understand, wasn't all that successful because, well, they weren't grown up as peasants, etc. And talking down to people like that is usually perhaps not perceived very well. It does remind me of a few groups who've done that in Britain as well. Like you know, they have all these student kids and, you know, become a tube driver. It's a good job, you know, pays quite well, but otherwise that, you know, that student would probably become a professor somewhere or something. So there was a whole generation of young people on the left in the 80s and 90s. They were still doing it, you know, become a normal worker. And that's how you speak to working people, which, you know, on one hand, obviously, you know, it's no good sitting on a mountain somewhere and preaching revolution to the people. But how do you think that kind of went? You know, did the peasants think, what the hell, what are you lot doing here? Or did they take to it quite well? How do you think that was perceived by peasants?
It was a complete disaster. It was a debacle. I think Kropotkin himself called it a year of madness. They all went charging off, and I mean, some of them, I'm sure, rendered valuable service as doctors or whatever else. But in terms of it transforming social consciousness within the Russian peasantry, it was a total waste of time. It also, in a sense, meant the loss of some good militants. I mean, there were people who were arrested as part of this, and for very little gain. It's certainly been over the years, certainly in my lifetime, different periods in which there has been a sort of a dewy-eyed veneration of the poorest of the poor. And of course, this was very much a part of Bakunin's position. I mean, a kind of veneration of even the lumpen proletariat, the déclassé elements, the chronically unemployed, and so on. And this has cropped up over the years and continues to crop up over the years. The idea of a kind of inherent nature of working class suffering to produce radicalism. And of course, on one level, it does in terms of struggle, in terms of people learning lessons involved in industrial disputes or whatever else. But the idea that somehow you could just go along, I mean, it used to happen all the time. I remember during the miners' strike, being at City University and being in the miners' support group. I was a member of a couple of miners' support groups, and the one at City University was dominated by the SWP, and they all wanted to go up to Northumbria, to County Durham, which is actually where my family's from, on my mum's side. So I could have had a free place to stay. And the cost of doing it I'd rather 40 odd quid to go and do up there. I'd rather just give that directly to the miners. There's a bloody colliery down in Kent. We could go and see them. But this idea that somehow we've got to sort of rub shoulders with miners in Northumbria, just on a kind of SWP glee club outing. So it does have its resonance even today. I think the importance was, I think, the social composition of people like Narodnaya Volya and the social composition of Narodniki was, most of them were the sons of minor nobles of one sort or another. Even Vera Verzulich was the daughter of a Russian Pole, as it were, and a lot of them had previously had serfs and all sorts of other things. So yes, and I think that their kind of agrarian anarchism, agrarian socialism, was a direct reflection of the social relations under which a lot of them had lived, and a direct reflection of the social relations of the Russian Empire at the time.
I mean, we shouldn't forget. I mean, this is Engels, Rosa Luxemburg, etc. I mean, they all did write about the Russian village, which was very egalitarian organized, wasn't it? It was very, you held the land in common, etc. There was a lot of good things about it, and very, wouldn't say progressive, but egalitarian way, in that, they shared everything, etc. And it was not just in Russia; it was in a lot of other places, and this kind of led to Marx and Engels in particular to also think about that whole question of primitive communism, and that is a way we could live in the future, something along those lines. But of course, on a higher level, and that is, I think, the point that Marx made, isn't it? That it has to be efficient. Otherwise, you just end up working 18 hours a day, slaving away. You're the opposite of free. You are actually a slave to the little plot of land, etc. Even if you share it, it's still very inefficient. I think, though, at the heart of this seems to be an understanding that it's not the working class that is the one driving revolution and change, but that these groups had the idea that it's the peasantry, isn't it, rather than the working class, and that is obviously a serious misconception. Did Marx make that point at all?
In the correspondence with Vera Verzulich, he was really focused on the land question more directly. I think, without doubt, though, the Marx and Engels assigned a leading role to the proletariat. However, I don't think either of them would have considered for one moment that proletariat could have, in some sense, taken power. From that point of view, Plekhanov is interesting for many reasons, but one is that he seemed to have in his work an idea that there has to be this transition to capitalism first. There has to be a constituent assembly. There has to be a development of the organs of liberal democracy, as it were, before it would be even possible to consider socialism. And of course, on the one hand, one can see why he would have held that view, and one can see why, because that was a widely held view by Lenin. Apart from anything else, nobody really expected the idea that the proletariat, being as small as it was, could play that kind of leading role. But certainly when it came to the Obshchina, yes, was a kind of democratic element to it, and it was, but of course that has to be qualified. Remember, it's a patriarchal organization as well. And in the drafts to the reply to Verzulich, Marx is at pains to point out really that the Obshchina is really just the last vestiges of something that had existed elsewhere, indeed throughout Europe and beyond. And there was another interesting point he makes in his drafts, but he didn't communicate it directly to Verzulich afterwards. Was that what's very important is not to just simply take the land off the peasants, not to just seize their products in an effort to feed the proletariat. And it's quite clear, because he basically says that if you take the land off the peasants, you won't keep them on the land. And he pointed to, for example, British imperialism's disastrous handling of the land question in the East Indies, to show how the British seizure of land, or British attempts to kind of remove it from kind of subsistence farming, just simply led to a catastrophic decline in agricultural production and famine. And of course, in that sense, we have a grim presage of what actually happened to agriculture in the Soviet Union. Faced with being told you have to hand over one of your two cows to the collective farm, they just ate it, or they had a big feast, rather than part with it. And from that point of view, forced collectivization destroyed the Obshchina in a way that capitalism, we could only ever countenance, would never have done. Of course, in the context of the common ownership of land in Britain, the moving of peasants off the land took place over a far, far longer period of time. Was still going on in Marx's day. There were still enclosures of common land that were taking place in Marx's day, but effectively most of the land was in private hands in Britain. And so Marx was fully aware of the whole history of the movement away from communal holdings of land. But of course, in the context of Britain, it was the early development of capitalism which did it, and therefore produced an agricultural revolution, which was an important prerequisite of the Industrial Revolution. And of course, that didn't happen in Russia. And of course, the consequences of the forced collectivization were disastrous.
I mean, this question is, of course, a really tricky one, isn't it? I mean, it sort of touches as well on the problems of the Russian Revolution. What you do in a country where, I don't know how 85% still peasantry, but you've managed to have a revolution, and you can't go to capitalism, you can't go to socialism. I mean, it almost was it had to become something quite different, almost by definition, when the German working class couldn't make revolution. Just one quick, before I open up to comrades who've got their hands up, is the issue of terror as a means of trying to achieve your goal, again, which has not gone out of fashion, to put it mildly. Seen some of it recently. The idea of, obviously there's what is violence of the oppressed, when they fight back. That's not necessarily terror, but the sort of the idea of Lenin's brother is an interesting one, because Lenin obviously argued against that tactic, as did Marx. That you can sort of, I think the idea of Lenin's brothers, the politics behind it was, if you can show that the Tsar can be blown away, then you show he's just a man, the whole system could be swept away. Having said that, I mean, they did it 6 years before, and, it led to a period of total counter-revolution rather than revolutionary upsurge, etc. To then do it again and hoping that this time, it would lead to revolutionary upsurge seems quite, desperate, I guess, very short-sighted, impatient, etc. Do you know anything more about how Lenin or Marx reacted to that kind of strategy?
Well, Marx and Engels were not unsympathetic to the idea that people faced with brutal, oppressive regimes would resist, and they would do so violently. And they weren't clearly pacifists. But of course, there's a difference between the idea of a class acting using violence to achieve its aims as a class, and a small group of conspirators who are acting in place of the class in the hope that they can then drag the labouring classes along with them. I don't think they had any qualms about people defending themselves, as it were, and you know, we see Marx writing all sorts of things about the uprisings in India, for example, where the bourgeois press would attack the sepoys for rebelling against British rule in the army and that kind of thing. And Marx had no qualms about saying, well, it's just a reflection of what the British imperialists are doing to the population of India. And so therefore you can't be surprised. But he's not arguing for violence for its own sake. Of course, the other aspect of terror and the terror and ways in which it's been used, of course, was a reference to the French Revolution and the importance placed by Robespierre of having to defend the revolution, if necessary, by violent means, to stop the counter-revolution. And of course, that's not unfamiliar to any of us who've been trawling through Marx's literature over the years. And of course was a feature of the Red Terror, for example, in the Russian Revolution. You know, as we all know, the October Revolution was more or less a bloodless coup. But the response of the white forces, the counter-revolution, being on a huge and bloody scale, meant that there had to be a fight back. And of course, what you then get is the founding of the Cheka. And of course, for some, by 1920, the revolution's gone because, Plekhanov and others were very critical of the authoritarian stance of the Bolsheviks. But in the end, if your back's against the wall, what do you do? The problem was, of course, that they were isolated. Now, should they have just gone down like the Paris Commune as a noble lesson in history and just, or should they have all just buggered off to Switzerland, leaving working class militants to be butchered, or do they fight back and hope for a revolution to break out elsewhere? That's a debate for another session, but the whole role of terror is an important one. And of course, there's terror, and then there's the defense of one's own communities, often for which one often has very little choice.
Indeed. But, with people like Alexander Ulyanov, if he was half as clever as Lenin, there's also the problem then, you've taken a potential revolutionary leader away, because you're either going to be in prison or you're going to be executed, etc. And that is another problem with individual terror like that, or trying to impose individual terror. Okay, I'll open up now. Comrades, if you have a question or would like to make a contribution, just click raise hand or put it in the chat. Pamela, you were first, but I've tried to make you a panelist and that's not working. We could just talk now if you want to make a contribution. Pam, did you want to come in? You've got your hand raised.
Okay, I'm back. Yeah. Okay, yeah. So, I didn't know about the communal nature of the peasant holdings in Russia. So I suppose that was a sort of basis of support for Marxist ideas. So my first question was, how, were socialist ideas spread both in the peasantry and the industrial working class? And then I made another comment about how Russian and Polish Jews who were Zionist, when they emigrated to Israel, they had this utopian ideal that Israel would be a socialist country and set up the kibbutz movement, completely cynically used by the Zionist government. And then the other thing that struck me when you were talking about the famine in India and the aim of British imperialism in trying to destroy the communal land holdings there, the amount of famines that were perpetrated by British imperialism. So I was thinking about Ireland struck me. I mean, this is a bit off topic, isn't it? But and then of course what happened in the Ukraine, which has its repercussions today in the Ukraine-Russian war, and the basis of that hostility, that memory of what they did to the peasantry. I think that's also fun. Thanks.
Thanks, Pam. Do you want to answer some of these things?
Yeah, I think they're all very important points. Marx and Engels wrote extensive, or Marx in particular, spent a huge amount of time looking at agricultural questions, and of course, Marx and Engels were both fully aware of what had happened in the Irish famine, not least of which was Engels' partner was an Irish woman he lived with in Manchester, and she was known to have a vituperative hatred of English absentee landlords in the context of Ireland. Of course, in the context of, it's an interesting one for all sorts of reasons, and it's a bit different because, after all, landholdings in Ireland before the famine were not on the basis of primogeniture. Landholdings in Britain were on the basis of primogeniture, so the oldest boy cops the lot, and that's a good way of inheriting land if what you want to do is accumulate. And then and that's particularly useful if you're moving away from feudal agricultural production, but capitalist agricultural production. You're producing goods for an agricultural market. In the context of England, there was the wool trade was particularly important. And that was given a powerful impetus by the dissolution of the monasteries. Vast areas of land now became farming for the market rather than merely the small surplus being sold by peasants. In the context of Ireland, there was no primogeniture. Celtic inheritance of land meant that the land would be subdivided. So if a farmer had 3 sons, then on his death, each gets a parcel of land. And one of the reasons why the famine was so devastating was because the lands were quite small, but the potato, of course, is very effective as a means of providing a lot of calories. But of course, you're dependent on that one crop, you're wiped out. Of course, and in the context of the British ruling class, they didn't give a shit, in the sense that, effectively famine cleared peasants off the land very quickly in a way in which the enclosures had done so over a long period of time in England. So the questions around land, which don't seem to be as to the fore today as they were then, because there's no peasantry as such in the United Kingdom. There's no peasantry really in most of Europe. Some small scale, but it's actually more small scale agricultural capitalism rather than a system based on peasantry. And in the context of India, Marx was very understood entirely the way in which it had British mishandling of the land question in the context of India had been a disaster. And of course, about the Ukraine, we know about the question of Jews emigrating to Palestine. Some of them were influenced by left-ish ideas, but the Jewish Workers' Bund had no truck whatsoever with Zionism. The Jewish Workers' Bund was passionately opposed to Zionism, would never have argued for a migration to Palestine. On the contrary, would have argued very firmly the role was to stay and take part in revolution right here, right now, and in so doing, do away with anti-Semitism.
Steve, please.
Hi. Ian, thanks very much for filling in a big gap there for me, or things that I'd forgotten either things I'd forgotten or things I didn't know about in the first place. I don't know which one it is, but it's a mix of both of those. So the comments I wanted to make are really more of emphasis, not really disagreements with anything that's been said, but I'll just stick it in the context of what I see in this. So I'm seeing this as using my normal theme, of course, is a struggle between anarcho-communism and Republican communism. And this is what's taking place in the 19th century. From anarcho-communism, you really have the Socialist Revolutionary Party, a petty bourgeois party, which in some ways is more extreme. It's more left-wing, really, because they supported individual terror. They had a utopian view about socialism and the peasantry. So they were the more left-wing, if you like, than the RSDLP, or what was to become, what should develop into the RSDLP, with its minimum program, with its basing itself in the working class, and fighting its minimum, fighting for its Republican program. Now, I think the essence of Marxism for me is that socialism grows out of advanced capitalism. The more highly developed is the capitalism, the more highly developed is the proletariat, and the more educated it is. And that's where the socialism is going to come from. Not from the most backward parts of capitalism. But on the other hand, revolution tends to come out of the backward part, in the sense that the people who are most downtrodden, the most who are losing out most. And so I think you might say that there was a sense of peasant revolution, that the peasants' desire for more democracy, the peasants' desire for the end of the oppression of the landlord class in this society, make them sort of a revolutionary democratic class in a certain sense, but qualified by the fact that their material conditions was they were a class that was going to die. I mean, from a Marxist sense, capitalism would eventually oust them. There wouldn't be the peasant. They might be turned into agricultural laborers, but their position as a peasant class was one in a way that was doomed. And so for Lenin, the real revolutionary democratic class was the proletariat. And so the development, so he was therefore interested, as Marx was, in the development of capitalism in Russia, because he saw that was the way that progress towards socialism could go. And getting rid of the Tsar, overthrowing the Tsar, creating a republic, if it didn't bring socialism, it would allow an even more rapid development of capitalism. And therefore, it would eventually create a stronger working class. And it would be best if you had that revolution under the leadership of the working class. Hence, that's what the role of the RSDLP and its minimum program was. So I know we haven't talked about that particularly, but I think that your talk, Ian, for me anyway, was to really illustrate that route from the anarcho-communism, the socialist revolutionaries, that intellectual and kind of more extreme, if you like, leftism, which turns out to be not that left-wing after all, as we see when we get to the Russian Revolution. These extreme socialist revolutionary party wasn't that really. When push comes to shove, you can see that the Bolsheviks were to the left of that party, but they appeared for a long time to be to the right of it. Yeah, I'll finish there, I think.
Not strictly part of the talk, but yes, I agree. That would be an interesting, if you know a bit more about that, Ian, how they...
Yeah, sure. I mean, let's remember that the SRs at the time of the Russian Revolution had 1 million members. They were far and away massive compared to either the Bolsheviks or the Mensheviks. Huge organization. The other aspect of it is the question about what kind of slogans do you put forward? What kind of demands do you advance? The other aspect of it, of course, is the war. Just as there were the vast majority of the working population of the Russian Empire were peasants, so was the army. The army was a peasant army. And so the the demands put forward by the Bolsheviks of land to the peasants and peace was a way of taking power, was a way of taking state power. Quite clearly, they were advancing something that the SRs were not advancing, particularly the right of the SR party, because the right of the SR party was happy. They were in favour of continuing the war. Kerensky, who was a part of the Trudovik group within the SRs, wanted to continue to prosecute the war, and that was why, in a sense, the decision, for example, of Axelrod to join the government was so strange, really. You know, the idea that you could, having been at Zimmerwald, to then go on and take part in a government which is in favour of the war. Ironically, I mean, you look at it in different ways. You could argue that Lenin just simply wasn't being honest. He had no intention of giving land to the peasants. The idea of simply repartitioning the land made no sense at all. I don't know whether Lenin was aware of the correspondence between Verzulich and Marx. He would almost certainly have been aware that there had been some, but the extent letter that actually was sent by Marx to Verzulich was just a couple of paragraphs and had no details in it. But would really Lenin have been in favour of all the land just simply being partitioned up and given out to the peasants? I doubt it very much. After all, wouldn't that just be a very inefficient form of agriculture? By contrast, I think he would have gone along with Marx had he seen those drafts, with the idea that actually agriculture has to be mechanized, it has to be efficient, it has to feed vast numbers of people, after all, and it was already failing to do so in the form taken by the Obshchina. So was Lenin just being dishonest? I think he was putting forward a program that was fully in tune with the social conditions of the time. It was a peasant army fighting in an unwinnable war and dying in droves. And it would have been a popular slogan. It clearly had no intention of actually partitioning out the land. I just want to draw this distinction, I suppose, between the Lenin of the state and revolution and Lenin elsewhere. Because clearly there's the bourgeois republic, which is what Plekhanov effectively comes down in favour of, because he believes that there has to be this linear connection between feudalism, then you have to go through capitalism, and then you can have the possibility of socialism. And therefore, a bourgeois republic is the best way of having a democratic society which can improve conditions overall and provide the possibility of a socialist movement that can organize legally. And then there are the Soviets, which propose a completely different sort of republic. And ironically, there's a contradiction in Plekhanov's work, isn't there? On the one hand, he's talking about direct participative democracy in his draft program of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, and what actually happened when it came down to it, the Soviets were a direct participative democracy, workers taking power in their own factories and peasants taking power on their own land. But Plekhanov, in the end, backed away from that. What he was in favour of was a bourgeois republic as a transitional, as a kind of transitional period, not a dictatorship of the proletariat, which is what Lenin is advocating in the State and Revolution.
There's a question in the Q&A which sort of touches on this as well, by Bill. I'm just going to read it out. It's a long question. I'm just going to read out the part that is concretely a question. In Russia, the Social Democrats clearly supported republicanism, but the working class there certainly was not the immense majority of the population. The peasantry was, and the peasants could not be expected to support socialism in the same way as the proletariat. Therefore, did the Russian social democracy, the Russian Social Democrats actually expect to lose power and become an opposition party after the revolution? Basically, that the revolution would establish all the constitutional prerequisites for socialism, but the proletarian party would not be in power until capitalist development created a proletariat large enough to give the party their support. Do you think that view is correct?
It was a bloody good question. I mean, Lenin writes that intriguing little pamphlet, Can the Bolsheviks Retain State Power? And when he wrote it, they were nowhere near state power, not a whiff. And it was thought of as deranged. What are you on about? Can the Bolsheviks retain state power? Precisely for the questions, for the points you've made. You know, you have a vast peasantry, most of which, insofar as they have any interest in socialism at all, it might well have been something like, you know, the Obshchina writ large, the Obshchina plus not having to work on the Lord's land. Remember, before the abolition of serfdom, this was a system of corvée. They had to work on the Lord's land, and the Lord kept the produce. Well, the Lord, I mean the Russian equivalent. I don't think for one moment the Bolsheviks, apart from Lenin at that time, thought they would have any. I mean, they were all almost to a person in favor of a constituent assembly and the establishment, effectively, of the Republican preconditions for the possibility of socialism. You know, so democratic elections and freedom of the press, and if you look at the program of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, a lot of the minimal demands are precisely around that, the extension of liberal democracy to the Russian Empire. I had to laugh, actually, when I looked at Lenin's draft of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, and it's in volume 2 of Lenin's collected works. At one point, there's a whole list, and it's not dissimilar to that of Plekhanov's. At one point, though, in the minimal demands, he calls for the convening of the Zemsky Sabor. But what? That's a medieval form of organisation. But I mean, bearing in mind he was writing this in 1898 when he was in prison, and the notion of the Zemsky Sabor may have still have had a popular consciousness. Now, the Zemsky Sabor was a bit like the a convening of a meeting of the estates of the realm. You know, you'd have different estates, so the aristocracy and the church and the Zemsky Sabor, as called by czars in the Middle Ages, would have been a way of convening. And here's Lenin using this term, the Zemsky Sabor, but then he goes on in the same draft to say it would be a gathering of all equal citizens. So on the one hand, he's using this feudal form, but I think there must have been at the time a kind of a broad kind of understanding of what that would have meant in terms of a gathering that would help to draft a new constitution in a democratic way, because Lenin then goes on to talk in terms of equal citizens drafting this constitution. And you can see then how even in Lenin's writing, it's influenced by Russia's history, and the use of language is of course inherently rooted in the history of in this case peasant production and so on. I was amused by it, but obviously he isn't really referring to a feudal middle-aged Zemsky Sabor. He's talking about something else. And of course, there was no other means at the time. Bearing in mind, he'd written this in 1898. He at that time would have been thinking in terms of a constituent assembly, and that Zemsky Sabor would have been the idea of a peasant masses being able to come forward and put ideas forward.
Mm. And of course, also when just before the Russian Revolution, Lenin in particular was very insistent that the Germans have to make revolution, otherwise our revolution is buggered. I mean, he was quite aware that by itself Russia could not do it, and well, so it proved to be over a while, didn't it? Steve's got a follow-up question, I believe.
If only if somebody.
That's fine.
The comrades aren't coming in, Tina, that's all. So I think I was going to make I think you made the point about that rather strange idea. I think that Lenin and the Russian revolutionaries would take old institutions and fill them with different content, wouldn't they? Because they were appealing to people in a language that they understood. And it's the same as that, although the peasantry is doomed, as it were, with the development of capitalism, the idea of peasant cooperation, the idea of that spirit of people working together is something to be focused upon in order to explain to people what socialism might be like. So we don't say, well, you've had it with your peasant cooperation, it's all going to become capitalist. That would be just kind of dismissing it. It's a way of, how can you, if you want to speak to people in a language that they understand, rather than some obscure language, you have to take up these sort of institutions and try to explain them in a different way, and try to take those things which are, if you like, proto-socialist in a certain sense, and try to mobilize them. But I think that the idea of the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry was always the idea that the working class could not rule on its own in such a peasant country, and it had to make compromises with the peasantry. But the idea was that the working class could lead, but if the working class started to substitute itself for the peasantry, and then the party would substitute itself for the working class, and the way you go into a very dangerous sort of direction. So I think they didn't believe that they could abolish capitalism in Russia. They never did, by the way. But they would have certainly needed the German working class to be able to have done that, and I think they all understood that. And I also remember, I don't think we knew about Soviets till 1905. So I think I might be wrong on that. I don't know, but I don't think so. In which case, the idea of Soviet democracy, as it were, wouldn't have come into the picture, I don't think, until that revolution brought it really onto the agenda in a way, and maybe shaped the idea that you could have a different kind of republic. I think that's what was really the lesson. You could have a different kind of republic than the one that they'd previously conceived. And I don't think Lenin thought that you could necessarily abolish capitalism in Russia given its conditions. But the most rapid development of capitalism would be led by the working class. And that seems quite a contradictory, really. But the more radical and revolutionary that you uprooted all the old ways of doing things, the more rapidly that capitalism and the working class would develop. And therefore and therefore eventually the working class would be. And final point, Ian, is this. I wonder whether, I would have thought, maybe the minimum program could have spoken about the nationalization of the land. You would think that would have been the thing that they'd spoken of. But I guess if they handed all the land out, they would have imagined that sort of a peasant capitalism would, so before you knew where you are, peasant capitalism would get going, steaming along. And before you know where you are, you'd have an agricultural proletariat. So it might have just been opportunism to hand out the land, but it might have been consistent with the idea that capitalism had to develop more rapidly in agriculture, and peasant capitalism and peasant competition, which is what happened really, I think, eventually. With, the middle peasants and the rich peasants and all those other things going on as well.
Thanks, Steve. Do you want to reply to that, Ian?
There was certainly an aware of the possibility of peasant capitalism, and in Marx's draft letters, which were never sent to Verzulich, effectively at one point in the first draft, he says, "Look, it might as well be. You might as well have peasant capitalism, because it's happening anyway. It's happening, under the pressure of capitalism anyway." The other thing was, Lenin might not have really understood Soviets, but Trotsky most definitely did, because of course he was there as chair of the Petrograd Soviet, and just as I think State and Revolution is the best thing Lenin ever wrote, I think 1905 is one of the best things Trotsky ever wrote, precisely because he was aware of what was going on, and he could see the way in which the proletariat could, in a sense, have a shortcut despite the fact that it was a minuscule part of the overall labouring population, played a disproportionately influential role, partly because of its output was enormous for the size of it, because although Russian capitalism was late developing, the Russian factories were huge and actually quite efficient from that point of view. So Trotsky had a better understanding of Soviets and the importance of that kind of direct participative democracy than Lenin did at that point. And of course, it's really in a sense that one could argue that in State and Revolution, Lenin becomes a Trotskyist. What was the other thing? Yeah, I think that was about it. Yes.
Lenin becomes a Trotskyist. Okay, well,
no, I think Trotsky became a Leninist, is what I understood.
I thought. I got that wrong. I'm just going to read out one more question from Diana, who is questioning that our assumption that food production can only be efficient on large-scale land holdings, and she thinks that's not currently borne out in praxis. Large land holdings are profitable for capitalists rather than good for production.
It's that distinction, I suppose, between commodity production and what would happen under socialism. I think there's obviously a good case to be made for large-scale production can exhaust the land, but so can small-scale production. I mean, one of the points that Marx makes in his letters to Verzulich, or the drafts at least, was that because these were parcels of land. Not every peasant would have had a cow. Not every peasant would have had animals that would have fertilized the land. There wasn't, in Britain, for example, land holdings are taking a capitalist form of crop rotation. So you have, cereals in one field, cows in another, and then you have maybe a field growing grass and clover to feed the animals over the winter, and then you have a fallow field. Very efficient in its time, and the basis of the agricultural revolution, which was a necessary prerequisite for the industrial revolution. In the context of Russia, you're talking about little strips of land farmed with if you were lucky, an ox pulling a wooden plough. Later on, when the disastrous campaigns against the kulaks. A kulak could be just somebody who had 2 cows instead of 1. And so large-scale production that Marx was arguing for, he had in mind, for example, the crop rotation system that existed, for example, in England at the time. What we've seen in British agriculture, for example, is that crop rotation system has been gotten rid of, and along with it, hundreds of thousands of miles of hedgerow, which is vitally important for all sorts of wildlife. What would a socialist agriculture look like? I don't know, but I don't think what we would say is we would sacrifice nature for the sake of just simply producing more. There's a good argument to say that actually great tracts of land would be better off just simply returned to being wild, not because out of some hippie kind of nonsense of wanting to sort of step back in time, but because of obvious ecological benefits that would follow from it, that would be good for all of us. But you can't do that in a capitalist context. You can't ask a capitalist farmer not to rip up their hedgerows, because that will decimate the bird population or whatever, because the only thing that matters to an agricultural capitalist is profits. So I think you could actually have, ironically, in a socialist society, a different sort of agriculture altogether. And why would it not be that case? So you wouldn't be producing for the market, but we would also have to make sure everybody had enough to eat. Because there's no point scratching around in the soil and having unproductive farms, which because once you end up with scarcity, then the whole crap starts all over again. You end up with the basis for the formation of a class.
And it's about freeing humans from that kind of labor to survive, isn't it? I mean, peasant life is one of the hardest ways of living. I mean, you're up at 4, milk the cow, can't go on holiday, etc. It is a tough as nails existence, and for very, very little, return, especially in today's capitalism, if you're a small landholder. So it needs to make sense in terms of human liberation, in terms of not messing up the planet. but also, efficiency for sure. So there needs to be a balance, needs to be found that is not within our grasp at the moment, because it is so messed up within capitalism, but will no doubt be developed once we are in charge. Thank you very much, Ian. We're going to finish today a little bit earlier than usual. Perhaps it's like Steve and myself, this is not a subject that we know an awful lot about, but we've learned a lot. So thank you very much, Ian, for that. Next week, we're looking at Marx and his engagement with trade unions and syndicalists. And that will be an interesting discussion, no doubt also about the limits of trade unionism, which we are witnessing today, I'd say, and have been for some time. Thank you very much, Ian. Thank you, comrades, and see you next week. Bye-bye. That was Russian, was it?
Good night, comrades.
Good night, comrades. Gute Nacht.